Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
So today we're jumping into, well, it's a massive topic, artificial intelligence.
Massive is right. It feels like it's absolutely everywhere now.
It really does. And you hear these incredible promises all the time, right? Things like revolutionizing healthcare, totally transforming transportation. It's honestly easy to get kind of swept up in the excitement.
Oh, absolutely. The potential seems huge.
But here's where we want to dig in today. What about the hidden risks, especially, for people who might already be vulnerable? And how much are our own values, our existing power structures, actually getting woven into these really powerful systems?
That's such a critical question. I think the conversation really needs to shift beyond just, wow, look what AI can do, technically speaking.
Right.
It's fundamentally about understanding the underlying societal structures that AI can either end up amplifying or, if we're really careful and intentional about it, maybe even help to dismantle.
That's a perfect setup. And it leads us straight into what this deep dive is all about. We're exploring this concept called Decolonial AI. We're drawing heavily from a really significant paper with that same title by Shakir Mohammed, Marie-Therese Ping, and William Isaac.
A foundational piece for this discussion.
Absolutely. So our mission, really, is to unpack how critical theories, specifically decolonial thinking, can actually work as a foresight tool, a powerful one.
The goal being?
The goal being to help make sure AI development really does align with the ethical principles we say we value and actually promotes justice, for everyone, not just a select few.
So by the end of this, hopefully you'll have a much clearer picture of how values really do shape technology.
Yeah.
Look at some specific examples where AI might maybe inadvertently perpetuate some historical injustices. That's what the paper calls algorithmic coloniality.
We'll unpack that term.
Definitely. And crucially, we'll also touch on some practical tactics, things we can actually do to build a more ethical, more equitable AI future.
Okay, so let's start with how we even think about AI. It's easy to just see it as, well, a tool, right? A piece of tech.
Right. The shiny object.
Exactly. But the paper makes this crucial distinction. AI has this kind of dual nature. It's both an object and a subject. Let's start with AI as an object. What does that mean?
So viewing AI as an object, that's seeing it as the technological artifact itself. And think about the last, maybe 2 decades?
Yeah, explosive growth.
It's just incredible advancement, driven by huge increases in computational power, vast amounts of data becoming available, and of course, better algorithms. Things like deep learning really took off.
That ability for AI to learn complex patterns from just massive data sets.
Exactly. Almost like how we learn to recognize faces or understand language. That really propelled things forward.
And these innovations, they've led to completely new applications, right?
Yeah.
Transport, healthcare.
Everywhere. How we navigate cities, how health is managed. But, and this is vital, AI as an object, as a powerful tool, it also carries this potential for misuse, often in ways the original designers just couldn't have foreseen. Cathy O'Neill talks a lot about these weapons of mass destruction having unintended consequences.
Okay, so that's AI as the object, the tool.
Yeah.
But then you said it's also a subject. What does that mean for us?
Well, if you connect that to the bigger picture, AI as a subject means it's also this complex web of networks and institutions.
So more than just code.
Much more. It's profoundly shaped by governments, by industries, by civil society too, through the regulations we create or maybe fail to create.
The ethical guidelines people try to follow.
Exactly. And the actual algorithmic architectures that end up getting widely adopted. It's not isolated tech. It's deeply woven into our social fabric.
So this dual nature, object and subject, it really forces some fundamental questions on us, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like, what values should AI actually uphold? How do we stop existing power imbalances from just completely undermining efforts to reduce harm? And maybe the trickiest one, how do the value systems we don't even acknowledge, how do they blind us to future harms, stop us from even seeing them coming?
These are definitely not just technical questions. They're deeply societal, deeply ethical.
Yeah.
And it leads us right into thinking about how we approach values within science itself. It's more than just the rules of science, like, is it consistent? Is it falsifiable? The purely epistemic stuff.
Right, the objective truth part.
Yeah. But what's also crucial are what are called contextual values. That's more about our shared moral compass, societal impacts, maybe even personal concerns. It's less about the science itself and more about how we choose to apply it in the world.
And there's a general agreement that these other values, these non-epistemic ones, they have a legitimate role to play.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a strong consensus on that, especially when it comes to applying scientific knowledge. It's unavoidable, really.
And we've seen this historically, haven't we? Ethical frameworks didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were often created because of terrible ethical failures in science.
Precisely. A really stark and truly disturbing example is the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee, where treatment was deliberately withheld from black men with syphilis for decades, just to study the disease's progression. Just horrific.
And that kind of thing, it led to major changes, right? Things like the Nuremberg Code after World War II.
Exactly. The Nuremberg Code in 1947, the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, and then the Belmont Report in the U.S. in 1978. These laid down the core ethical principles we still talk about.
Like respect for persons.
Mm-hmm. Beneficence, doing good, minimizing harm.
And justice, distributing risks and benefits fairly.
Those are the cornerstones.
Yeah.
Foundational.
So, okay, if we have these foundational principles, respect, beneficence, justice, why do they seem to kind of fall short when we try to apply them to something as complex as AI?
That's really the crux of it. AI presents these unique challenges. If you look at early AI ethics guidelines, maybe like the Asilomar principles back in 2017.
Yeah, I remember those.
They focus on really important risks. Don't get me wrong, like lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots, basically.
Oh, big, obvious dangers.
Right. But they often overlooked how security risks, for example, tend to hit conflict zones or developing countries first, places on the periphery.
Mm.
They also didn't always do a great job of separating social safety, how AI impacts people and communities, from purely technical safety, like does the code have bugs?
And
Crucially, these early frameworks didn't really get to grips with whose values were actually being represented, or the deep structural inequities that mean the benefits and the risks of AI just aren't spread evenly at all.
That feels like a massive blind spot. Can you give us a really clear example of how that plays out, an embedded bias that shows this unequal spread?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really compelling study from 2019 by Obermeyer and his colleagues. It gives a perfect illustration.
Okay.
They look at this algorithm that was widely used in the U.S. for selecting patients for healthcare programs, specifically high-risk care management programs. Extra support, basically.
Sounds like a good idea on the surface.
Exactly. But the study found it had this significant racial bias against African-American patients.
Wow. How did that happen? What was the mechanism?
Well, the algorithm was trying to prioritize essentially cost reduction or value for money. That was the value embedded by the health systems using it.
Okay. It sort of makes sense from a system perspective, maybe.
You can see the logic, but here's the problem. It relied on past health expenses as a proxy, a stand-in, for a patient's health need.
Ah, I think I see where this is going.
Right. Because of all the existing structural inequities in the U.S. healthcare system, access issues, historical distrust, things like that, African-American patients, even if they were actually sicker on average, tended to have lower healthcare expenses.
Because they weren't getting as much care in the first place.
Precisely. So the algorithm, by optimizing for lower cost based on past spending, indirectly ended up rejecting African-American patients from these extra care programs at a higher rate.
So it denied care to those who often needed it most.
And actively worsened the existing inequities. It's a stark example of coded bias.
So AI isn't just reflecting bias here, it's almost hiding the power dynamics, making it harder to see who's benefiting and who's harmed.
That's a key point the paper makes, drawing on work by scholars like Ruha Benjamin. She argued back in 2019 that today coded inequity is perpetuated precisely because those who design and adopt such tools are not thinking carefully about systemic racism.
It's not necessarily malicious intent, but a failure to see the system.
Exactly. And that really underscores the need for what the paper calls dynamic, robust foresight tactics. It's not enough to just come up with a new list of ethical principles. We have to really engage with the tensions, the contradictions between our stated values and how they actually play out.
Which brings us to this idea of a critical science approach, looking beneath the surface, right? Uncovering assumptions.
Yes, exactly. Trying to uncover those underlying cultural assumptions that tend to dominate a field or society more broadly. It's about examining values, culture, and crucially, power dynamics between different stakeholders and the technology itself.
Okay, so let's define some terms here. The paper talks about decolonization and coloniality. What's the difference?
Right. So decolonization generally refers to that intellectual, political, economic, societal work of restoring land and life after historical periods of direct colonial rule. It's about dismantling those formal colonial relationships.
Getting rid of the colonizers, basically.
In essence, yes. But the paper introduces this related but distinct and really crucial concept, coloniality.
Okay, coloniality. What is that? It sounds more persistent.
That's exactly it. Coloniality is the key idea here because it describes what survives colonialism. It's the logic, the power structures, the ways of thinking that linger long after the flags come down. It helps explain the continuation of those power dynamics between the advantaged and the disadvantaged, often rooted in historical dispossession and extraction. It shows how that power continues to shape culture, labor, knowledge production.
So it's still operating today?
Very much so. Thinkers like Coldry and Machias argued in 2019 that modern data relations, how our data is collected and used, can actually recreate a colonizing form of power. It's about those lingering impacts, how old structures persist in new, maybe digital forms.
So the paper's focus on structural decolonization is about tackling those persistent mechanisms of power, economics, language, culture, thinking.
Precisely. Undoing the coloniality that persists. And the paper outlines 3 helpful ways to view knowledge from this decolonial perspective.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's a decentering view. This is about rejecting the simple imitation of, say, Western models or ways of thinking. It calls for asserting unique identities and recentering knowledge from other perspectives. Think of Ngugawa Thiong'o arguing for African languages and literature instead of English, or movements to decolonize university curricula broadening beyond just the Western canon.
Makes sense. What's the second view?
The second is an additive inclusive view. This one doesn't necessarily throw out existing knowledge, but it explicitly recognizes and values new and alternative approaches alongside it.
So adding to the mix, not replacing.
Kind of. It's about fostering environments where different kinds of knowledge can genuinely flourish. It supports ideas like localization and pluriversalism, that concept of a world where many worlds fit, where diverse knowledge systems can coexist respectfully.
Okay, decentering, additive inclusive, and the third.
The third is the engagement view.
Yeah.
This one directly calls for more critical look at science itself. It pushes us to examine scientific practices from the perspective of the margins, to center the needs of marginalized populations in research and design. It constantly asks those tough questions. Where does knowledge come from? Who's included? Who's left out? Who benefits? Who gets silenced? What assumptions are we not even noticing?
It sounds like a much more critical, power-aware lens, and the paper uses that metropole-periphery model to help visualize this, right?
That's right. It's a useful framework. It identifies metropole centers of power, like powerful states or big tech corporations and peripheries, those with relatively less power, like civil society groups, or us as individual consumers.
And how does that help with AI?
It helps us map out contemporary practices in AI development and see them as potentially features of these continuing colonial dynamics.
Yeah.
Identifying who holds the power, who sets the agenda.
Like, you need to be careful with it.
Absolutely. It's a useful model, but we have to apply it carefully. It can sometimes oversimplify things into easy binaries like the West and the rest, which isn't always accurate or helpful. It needs to be part of a broader critical toolkit.
Okay, so bringing this all together, algorithmic coloniality, that's the core concept, applying this thinking to AI.
Exactly. Algorithmic coloniality is basically taking decolonial theory and applying it directly to digital technologies.
How does that work?
It recognizes that digital spaces, online platforms, data systems, they can effectively become new digital territories for exploitation, mirroring historical physical colonization.
Wow.
So the concept specifically looks at how algorithms can perpetuate discriminatory systems, how they influence geopolitics and global power balances, and how they impact things like labor practices, and even how we talk about ethics. It helps connect those historical patterns of power to what's happening right now in the digital world.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. Let's unpack that with some real-world impacts. The paper talks about specific sites of algorithmic coloniality. 3 main categories. First up, algorithmic oppression. What does that look like?
Right. Algorithmic oppression. This is when automated data-driven systems basically extend the unjust subordination of one social group while giving advantages to another.
So amplifying existing inequalities.
Often, yes. The key insight from a decolonial perspective is that these aren't usually brand new forms of oppression appearing out of nowhere. They're frequently old patterns, historical injustices being reinforced, maybe scaled up, and sometimes made harder to see by new technology.
Can you give some concrete examples of these systems in action?
Unfortunately, there are many. Think about the concerns around digital human rights with facial recognition systems, like Singapore's Lamppost as a platform project.
Right, putting cameras everywhere.
Or predictive policing systems being trialed or used in places like New Delhi. Or national identity systems like India's Aadhaar or Kenya's Huduma Namba. Even things like welfare interventions using algorithms, like one studied in New Zealand for Maori children. All these have raised serious questions about entrenching historical injustice, either to the stated goal is efficiency or fairness.
And it happens here too, right, in the U.S. criminal justice system.
Absolutely. Predictive AI in U.S. criminal justice has been shown to link back to data sets reflecting discriminatory policing patterns, essentially baking in historical bias.
And beyond these big systems, everyday stuff.
Yeah, everyday harms too. Facial recognition simply failing to detect black faces accurately or perpetuating gender stereotypes. Hate speech detection algorithms that flag black or queer vernacular speech as toxic because they weren't trained on it.
Oh, wow.
Biased recruitment tools filtering out perfectly qualified candidates. Automated airport screening systems that consistently flag trans bodies for invasive searches.
So the decolonial insight here is
that these aren't just isolated technical glitches or ahistorical problems. They are deeply, inextricably linked to what the paper calls histories of racist expropriation and these wider global systems of racial capitalism, class inequality, heteronormative patriarchy, all rooted in colonial history. The patterns repeat.
Okay, that's oppression.
Yeah.
Moving to the second site, the paper identifies algorithmic exploitation. How are institutions and industries taking advantage of people here?
This one is really stark when you look at the labor behind AI. Think about ghost workers.
Ghost workers.
Yeah. So much of AI's recent success relies on humans annotating, labeling, cleaning massive data sets. This work is often done by laborers in remote settings, frequently in the global south, paid extremely low wages, with very few, if any, labor protections.
So people clicking on pictures of traffic lights.
Exactly. Or identifying sentiment in text or transcribing audio. In some extreme cases, this work has involved prisoners or people in economically desperate situations, often in places with weaker labor laws.
So the paper frames this as a kind of continuity of knowledge and labor extraction, like a digital version of colonial resource extraction.
Precisely. A decolonial lens helps us see this not just as low-wage work, but as tapping into and exploiting existing post-colonial economic inequalities. It's an extension of those historical logics of extraction, mutated for the digital age, but the core dynamic of asymmetrical benefit remains.
And then there's this other practice mentioned, beta testing, potentially becoming ethics dumping. That sounds quite deliberate.
It can be deeply problematic, and it resonates uncomfortably with that long, terrible history of unethical scientific experimentation on marginalized groups, 19th century gynecology on enslaved black women, the Tuskegee study.
Right.
Ethics dumping is essentially when organizations test early, potentially risky software or algorithms in countries where regulations or safeguards are weaker, or where doing so might violate laws in their home country.
So exporting the harm, basically.
Exporting the harm and the ethical risk, often to vulnerable populations, frequently aligning, again, with those old colonial fault lines.
So, the example of Cambridge Analytica, they tested their tools in Kenya and Nigeria where data protection was weaker, before using similar methods in the US and UK elections. That fits this pattern.
The textbook example, sadly. They interfered with electoral processes there, partly as a testing ground. Or look at Palantir deploying experimental predictive policing algorithms in New Orleans, targeting African-American communities without real public oversight or approval.
It highlights that these aren't just abstract concerns. They have real-world impacts linked to historical exploitation.
Absolutely. The continuity is direct and undeniable when you look through this lens.
Okay, finally, the third site, algorithmic dispossession. How does this work? It sounds like taking things away.
It's about how new regulatory policies, or the lack thereof, in the digital economy can end up centralizing power, assets, or rights with a small minority, effectively depriving a disempowered majority. Think about who gets to set the rules.
Right. So who is at the table shaping global AI governance?
Well, a review back in 2019 highlighted a pretty significant imbalance. Regions like Africa, South and Central America, Central Asia, they were significantly underrepresented in the development of global AI ethics guidelines.
Meaning
meaning the debate is largely being shaped by the more economically developed countries, the metropoles. And there's a real risk that local knowledge, cultural pluralism, different value systems just get ignored or overridden. Their own values get exported as universal.
And this connects to that idea of AI nationalism, the fear that developing countries could just become dependent.
That's a core concern, yes, that developing countries might be forced into economic dependence on the so-called AI superpowers like China or the U.S., limiting their own agency in digital futures.
And you mentioned that G20 example.
Exactly. The 2019 G20 summit in Osaka, India, Indonesia, and South Africa refused to sign the Osaka Track on cross-border data flows because they felt their interests, the interests of developing nations, simply weren't being represented or protected in that framework.
They pushed back.
They did. And this dynamic of dispossession, of marginalization, can even show up in seemingly positive initiatives, like AI for Good.
Really? How so? Those sound beneficial.
Well, the critique is that sometimes these initiatives can default to attitudes of paternalism, this belief in technological solutionism like AI alone can fix deep social problems, and sometimes even predatory inclusion, where people are included but on terms that mainly benefit the powerful.
Leading to things like surveillance humanitarianism.
Exactly, where aid or development comes with increased surveillance or data extraction. The decolonial insight pushes back against this, calling for a shift towards systems that actually promote active, engaged political communities.
Driven by the communities themselves.
Yes, driven by the agency and self-ownership of the communities being served. Using strategies like genuine co-development, where the people affected are involved in designing and governing algorithmic interventions from the very beginning. Okay, so we've laid out the problems, the sites of algorithmic coloniality. This sounds pretty daunting. What does the paper suggest as a path forward? How do we actually build a decolonial AI?
It is daunting, but the paper does offer concrete tactics. The overall vision is really powerful. It's about fusing AI insights with decolonial theories to use that historical hindsight for better foresight.
Learning from the past to shape the future.
Exactly. The aim is to actively dismantle these harmful power asymmetries and move towards what they call a pluriversal epistemology.
Pluriversal epistemology. Break that down.
It basically means ways of knowing and ways of creating technology that genuinely acknowledge and respect diverse sociopolitical, ecological, cultural, and economic needs, moving away from a universal one-size-fits-all approach imposed from the center.
Okay, sounds good in theory. How do we get there? What are the tactics?
The paper outlines three main ones. First, moving towards a critical technical practice of AI, or CTP.
CTP. What's the core idea? CTP is about adopting a much more self-reflexive approach when actually developing and deploying AI systems. It means consciously recognizing the power imbalances and the implicit values that are always involved.
So, thinking critically while coding.
Essentially, yes. Philip Agree described it back in the 90s as a kind of middle ground between just doing the technical work and engaging in critical reflection. It's moving beyond just, good conscience design, feeling like you're doing the right thing, to continuously questioning the politically situated nature of the work, building tech with awareness.
And this CTP approach applies across different areas of AI, right? Like fairness.
Absolutely. For fairness, technical efforts to make algorithms fair have to consider the underlying power dynamics and colonial legacies to have any hope of achieving truly fair outcomes. We have to ask, fair for whom? According to whose definition? Are we just patching the surface or getting at the roots?
Makes sense. And safety.
For safety, it means integrating social safety right alongside technical AI safety. Actively questioning whose values, whose goals are being represented and embedded in these systems, moving beyond just preventing crashes or errors to preventing societal harm.
Diversity is another big buzzword in tech. How does CTP reframe that?
Yeah, with a critical lens, diversity isn't just a pipeline issue or a business case for better products, though it might be those things too. It's reframed as a critical practice that directly confronts homogenization and cultural colonialism. This leads to more intersectional approaches, as D'Ignazio and Klein put it, recognizing how different forms of oppression overlap and interact.
And policy needs this approach too.
Definitely. Policy efforts should support localized AI development in developing countries. Things like UNESCO projects or Sierra Leone's digital strategy are steps in the right direction. But crucially, even these international organizations need to be self-reflexive about their own position, potentially as metropoles. Are they truly empowering local communities or just imposing external agendas?
Always questioning the power dynamics. Can AI itself be used as a decolonizing tool? Can it help fight bias?
That's a really interesting and hopeful possibility explored in the paper. Some researchers are using AI to try and expose systemic biases, for instance, in medical care, aiming to reduce disparities.
Okay.
And there's the idea of fostering Creole technology.
Real technologies.
Yeah, AI systems that are taken and adapted to locally specific situations in really original ways, finding positive, distinctive uses that maybe weren't intended by the original designers. Think of local communities customizing AI tools to solve their unique problems rather than having generic solutions imposed from the outside.
That's really powerful. Okay, second tactic, reciprocal engagements and reverse tutelage. That phrase reverse tutelage sounds intriguing, flipping the usual power dynamic.
It absolutely is. This tactic emphasizes the essential, often overlooked role of colonized or marginalized peoples in actually changing the views within the metropole, the centers of power.
So the center learning from the periphery.
Exactly. Developing a kind of double vision, as some theorists call it, to undo those simplistic colonial binaries. It directly challenges that old idea of knowledge as absolute, flowing only from one source, usually the West.
Because AI researchers have power in deciding what even counts as knowledge, what goes into data sets.
Huge power. Deciding what counts as valid, what gets included, what gets ignored, that power cannot be left unexamined or unacknowledged.
So how do we actually do this reverse tutelage? The paper mentions dialogue, documentation, design.
Yes. So dialogue means fostering genuine, meaningful intercultural conversations and developing intercultural digital ethics. Advocating for pluralism, for those pluriversal ethics, rather than trying to impose one universal ethical framework on everyone.
Makes sense. Documentation.
For documentation, using tools like datasheets for datasets or model cards for model reporting, these make the assumptions, the limitations, the potential biases within datasets and AI systems explicit and transparent. And critically, learning from affected users about harms to actually make improvements.
Closing the feedback loop. And design.
And for design, it means implementing things like community-engaged research, genuine co-development strategies, using frameworks like the IE's ethically aligned design principles, or even things like citizens' juries, to directly involve the public in understanding and shaping AI's role and impact.
Giving people a real voice. Okay, that leads to the third and final tactic, renewed effective in political communities. What's the core idea here? It sounds like building connections.
It absolutely is about building connections and strengthening communities. This tactic emphasizes shifting away from paternalism, we know what's best for you, towards genuine solidarity.
Right.
It's about strengthening political communities so they can actively shape how AI is used, ensuring their inclusion and ownership, and crucially, creating real mechanisms for them to contest harmful technological interventions when they happen.
Because history shows paternalism doesn't work.
History shows paternalism and imbalances in authority perpetuate harm. The decolonial approach demands a move towards real solidarity, shared power.
So what tools can help build these communities and challenge those old ways of thinking?
One interesting tool mentioned is contrapuntal analysis, an idea from Edward Said. It means actively looking for and challenging those questionable binaries, often embedded in research like scientist versus humanist, natural versus artificial, rational versus emotional, to reveal the hidden power dynamics they often mask. It also means actively supporting the grassroots organizations already doing amazing work in this space, groups like Data for Black Lives, the Deep Learning Indaba in Africa, Black in AI, Queer in AI, Latinx in AI. There are many.
Amplifying existing efforts.
Exactly. And perhaps most profoundly, it's about cultivating what philosophers have called political friendship and effective communities.
Political friendship. That's a lovely phrase.
Isn't it? Drawing inspiration from philosophies like Ubuntu, I am because we are, or ideas of oneness. It's about developers, researchers, users forming real alliances, deep connections, moving beyond purely transactional or possessive relationships.
Why is that so fundamental for AI?
Because AI isn't developed in a vacuum. It's both shaped by and actively shapes our contemporary political communities. This reminds us that technology is never neutral. It's always a reflection and a shaper of our collective humanity, our relationships.
So wrapping this all up, it feels like building responsible AI, truly beneficial AI, is so much more than just a technical coding challenge.
Oh, it's vastly more. It really demands that we critically engage with the hierarchies, the philosophies, the power structures we've inherited from the past. It calls for, I think, a renewed and deeper sense of responsibility for the technologies we're creating right now, understanding their profound potential to either continue harmful patterns or, hopefully, help dismantle them.
And ultimately, the AI systems we choose to build, the ones we choose to deploy, They really do reflect us, don't they? Our values, our biases, our blind spots.
Profoundly. They reflect our answers, or maybe our lack of answers to some of the deepest philosophical questions. What does it really mean to be human? How do we navigate difference and disagreement? How do we learn to coexist both in our physical world and in these increasingly complex digital worlds we're building?
That's the core of it. And that's where the ongoing work really lies, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's where continuous research, critical thinking, and committed action are just profoundly needed. Because the future of AI isn't just about the code. It's fundamentally about our shared values and ultimately our shared humanity.